History is not as neat as school makes it look. Because once you move past the dates and dead kings, the past gets deeply strange. A nuclear disaster almost happened over the United States by accident. Europeans once ground up real mummies and swallowed them as medicine. A government was pushed to the brink by a smell so disgusting it could not function. And in medieval Europe, animals were dragged into court like human criminals. Now ask yourself this: how many of those sound completely made up? Because none of them are fiction. These are the kinds of stories that sound fake right up until you realize they actually happened. So before we begin, let me know in the comments which one sounds the most unbelievable to you. Tonight, we are diving into 10 historical facts that are almost impossible to believe. During the Cold War, the world expected nuclear catastrophe to come from war. But one of the worst close calls almost came from an accident. In 1961, a U.S. Air Force B-52 broke apart in the sky over Goldsboro, North Carolina, while carrying 2 hydrogen bombs. The bombs fell. That alone is terrifying. What makes it worse is that one of them reportedly went through several arming steps on the way down. Later reviews suggested the margin between safety and catastrophe may have been unbelievably small. It did not detonate. But for a moment, America came dangerously close to a nuclear disaster created not by an enemy, but by its own aircraft. No invasion, no missile strike, no war. Just a bomber falling apart over U.S. soil and dropping weapons powerful enough to erase a city. That is not a thriller plot. That is history. For centuries, parts of Europe treated ancient Egyptian mummies as something far more useful than historical treasures. They treated them like medicine. Actual human remains were bought, ground into powder, and used in remedies. This practice was tied to the belief that a substance associated with preserved bodies had healing value, which means people were literally swallowing the dead. It is hard to think of a stranger afterlife than that. A person could be buried in ancient Egypt, remain untouched for centuries, and then be dug up, traded across continents, crushed into dust, and sold to strangers who believed it might cure them. This was not fringe horror. This was something people genuinely accepted. The past becomes especially disturbing when people stop seeing something as shocking and start seeing it as normal. And few things prove that better than turning the dead into medicine. The Victorian era is often remembered as polished, elegant, and proper. But behind that image was a world that lived much closer to death than most people today can imagine. In the 19th century, families sometimes posed dead relatives for one final photograph. The bodies were dressed carefully, positioned in chairs or beds, and placed beside living family members. Photographers sometimes tried to make them look more lifelike, arranging them naturally, and even altering the final image. To us, it feels almost instantly. To them, it could be an act of love. Photography was expensive, and for many families, this might be the only picture ever taken of that person. That gave these photographs enormous emotional value. That is what makes them so unsettling now. They were not trying to create something horrifying. They were trying to hold on to someone they had lost. And that is often what makes history the most uncomfortable, when grief and horror are living in the exact same frame. In the summer of 1858, London was hit by a crisis so foul that it overwhelmed one of the most powerful capitals on earth. The River Thames had become an open sewer. Waste, runoff, and rotting matter had been dumped into it for years. Then the heat arrived. The stench rising from the river became unbearable. People gagged, covered their faces, and tried to stay away from the water. Even Parliament, sitting near the Thames, struggled to function while the smell rolled through the city. Officials soaked curtains in chemicals, hoping to block it out. It changed nothing. This became known as the Great Stink. And as absurd as that name sounds, it forced real action. The smell was so bad that it finally pushed London toward modern sewer reform. Think about that for a second. Not protest, not revolution, not invasion. A smell so hideous, it helped change the future of a city. In 1666, a fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane. That tiny beginning was all it took. London at the time was packed with wooden buildings, tight streets, and flammable materials. Once the flames caught, strong winds drove them through the city with terrifying speed. Homes vanished. Churches collapsed. Entire sections of London were swallowed by fire. Over the course of several days, much of the city was destroyed. What makes the Great Fire of London so gripping is not just the scale of the destruction, it is how easily it began. One building, one accident, one spark. History loves moments like that, moments where something enormous is born from something that should have stayed small. A city can look permanent, right up until the second it starts burning. The medieval world already had enough ways to die horribly. Then the Byzantine Empire introduced something that must have looked supernatural. It was called Greek fire. This was an incendiary weapon used against enemy ships and troops, and accounts describe it as a terrifying flame that was extremely difficult to extinguish. Even worse, it was said to keep burning on water. Imagine seeing that for the first time in battle. You are at sea, the enemy attacks, and suddenly the water itself seems to be on fire. No wonder it inspired panic. Its exact formula remains uncertain, which only adds to its legend. In its own time, it must have felt like a weapon pulled from myth, something halfway between chemistry and sorcery. History is filled with lost inventions. Few left behind such a frightening reputation. In medieval Europe, courts did not always stop at human defendants. Sometimes they prosecuted animals. Pigs, rats, cows, horses, and even insects were formally accused of crimes. Some were assigned legal representation, some were imprisoned, some were executed. And no, this was not satire. One famous case involved rats accused of destroying crops. Their lawyer argued they could not appear in court because the roads were too dangerous due to cats. As ridiculous as that sounds now, these trials were part of a worldview in which crime was seen as a disruption of moral order, and animals could be dragged into that logic. That means people once stood in legal proceedings and seriously debated the guilt of rats. History is not only violent. Sometimes it is so surreal that it feels like someone made it up as a joke and the entire century agreed to go along with it. In 1184, powerful nobles gathered in Erfurt to settle a serious dispute. Instead, they died in one of the most humiliating disasters in medieval history. The meeting was held in an upper room crowded with high-ranking men and their attendants. The wooden floor gave way under the weight. They crashed straight through into the cesspit below. Not a cellar, not a courtyard, a pit of human waste. Some drowned, others suffocated, others were crushed. This became known as the Erfurt latrine disaster. It sounds almost too grotesque to belong to real history, but it happened to some of the most powerful people in the region. There is something uniquely brutal about the way history humbles human status. You can arrive at a political summit as a noble and leave it as a cautionary tale in a sewer. In 1700, a massive earthquake struck off the coast of Japan. Japanese records preserved the disaster, but across the Pacific, on the coast of North America, something deeply strange happened. A large tsunami arrived with no local earthquake to explain it. To the people who witnessed it, the ocean simply rose without warning. No shaking, no immediate cause, just water surging in from nowhere. For a long time, the event remained a mystery. Only much later did scientists connect the evidence and realize the wave had crossed the Pacific from Japan. That is what makes this story so eerie. A violent event began on one side of the planet and reached another shore where nobody could possibly understand what had set it in motion. Sometimes, history is terrifying not because people know too much, but because they know absolutely nothing about what is about to hit them. Ancient armies did not read the sky the way we do. They saw omens, warnings, and messages from powers far beyond them. Around 585 BC, the Medes and the Lydians were in battle when the sun suddenly disappeared behind a solar eclipse. The battlefield went dark, and the fighting reportedly stopped. To modern people, an eclipse is explainable. To people in the middle of an ancient war, it could feel like the universe itself was intervening. That moment appears to have helped push both sides toward peace. It is one of those endings history occasionally delivers better than fiction ever could. Thousands of men fighting to the death, and then daylight vanishes and the war loses its nerve. No treaty first, no negotiations first, just the sky going black. Sometimes, the strangest force in history is not a ruler or an army, it is timing. History is not just dates, empires, and famous names. It is also full of moments that sound too bizarre, too dark, and too cinematic to be real. A nuclear disaster that almost happened by accident, the dead turned into medicine, a city nearly defeated by its own smell, a sea that seemed to catch fire, a war stopped by the sky itself. And the strangest part is this: for the people living through these events, none of it felt like a story. It was just reality. If you want more of history's darkest and most unbelievable truths, subscribe to The Killer Gardener, because the past is far stranger than fiction ever needed to be.